Hello everyone, my name is Jeffrey Frank, and I'm here to talk to you about the 7 key components of a disaster plan. First, I would like to say that the University of Alberta acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, and we respect the histories, languages, and cultures of the First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. I'm an emergency physician at the University of Alberta Hospital and the research director for the Department of Emergency Medicine. I have a master's degree in statistics, and I'm a visiting professor in disaster medicine at the l'Università del Piemonte Orientale in Novara, Italy, and I'm a faculty member at the European Master in Disaster Medicine. For conflict disclosure information, I am an employee at the University of Alberta, and I'm the CEO and founder of Stat59. We make statistics software, but I will not be talking about any of our products here today. The objectives of this lesson are, firstly, to recognize the basic components of a complete disaster plan. Secondly, to understand the advantages and disadvantages of different types of training exercises. And thirdly, to describe how to set up an effective debriefing. What are the basic components of a disaster plan? Now, a disaster plan should have all 7 of these components, which includes a hazard vulnerability analysis, some standard operating procedures, an organizational chart, job action sheets for all of the key jobs within the description, some forms, a debriefing plan, and a training plan. First, hazard vulnerability analysis. Hazard vulnerability analysis is extremely important. It is here that we do some sort of preparation before a disaster happens to decide what types of hazards are likely to afflict our area. And here we're looking at specific hazards, things that might happen to us. Perhaps we're in an earthquake-prone zone. Perhaps we're in an area that has lots of huge sporting events. Getting prepared by knowing what these are. And all plans should include this prep work done before the disaster. Second, standard operating procedures. Now, standard operating procedures are super important. One of the things that's very interesting about disaster response is the huge number of tasks that come up that nobody has ever done before. These are tasks that are not part of day-to-day operations and can be really tricky to figure out. What we don't want is people during a disaster to try to have to figure these out. So we have standard operating procedures. We describe these tasks in detail so that someone who's never done them before will be able to do them. One thing of note is that we do not use standard operating procedures for tasks that the responders do already on a day-to-day basis. For instance, if we were developing a standard operating procedure to help with radiologic studies in the department, we wouldn't need a procedure that tells ultrasound technicians how to do an ultrasound. They already know that. These are for tasks that are unique to the disaster response. So what kind of topics could this include? Well, we should have a very discrete and very concise description of when we activate the disaster plan. We should describe when we deactivate the plan. What if we have to evacuate our facility? We should definitely have a plan for that. We should have a standard operating procedure for decontamination of the contaminated victims, for personal protective equipment. We should have a standard operating procedure for triage. How are we going to triage the patients when they arrive? And how will the staff check in? How will we keep track of them? So all of these should be addressed in standard operating procedures in the disaster plan. So here's an example. Here is a standard operating procedure for the check-in procedure. You'll see it discusses the purpose of it, who it applies to, and just a set of things that must be done. For instance, it says here, item 3, at the check-in area, the name and time of arrival are recorded. And here's the form that they use for it. So this is a simple standard operating procedure. Number 3, the third vital component is an organizational chart. Now, whatever organizational system you use, some people prefer to use incident command system, some people use others, but whatever you use, you need to have an organizational chart for your disaster response. Now, one of the things that's very unique in hospital settings and in many healthcare settings is that we're kind of used to working alone and not really working so much as a team, but as working as independent practitioners. And this will not work for disaster response. So we must be prepared with an organizational chart which describes how this will work. And oftentimes these are built on the incident command system. Number 4, job action sheets. Now, job action sheets are very important because they allow people who have never done these tasks to do them in the event of a disaster. So, job action sheets, what are they? Well, they're checklists of tasks for each position in the organizational chart, and they should allow anyone to quickly assume the position. I always make sure that we assume that our responders have never trained and they need to be able to pick up this sheet and it tells them exactly what to do. And again, much like in the standard operating procedure, we don't tell responders how to do their usual day-to-day tasks. There's no need to write in here for a checklist that is for the charge nurse within the emergency department how to organize a trauma team. They know how to do that. So we don't tell people how to do their day-to-day task. So here you can see an example of a form for the incident commander. It starts by an overall mission statement. And generally this is a checklist that the position, you start from the top and work your way to the bottom. For instance, the first item, verify information if necessary and initiate the hospital disaster plan by declaring a major incident. Number 2, read the entire job action sheet. Number 3, put on your identification vest. This is a very simple thing. It's very effective. And as an incident commander or whoever's in charge of the incident, it's very easy to bring people on board. You assign them a role. I am assigning you as the logistics chief. Go read your job action sheet. Number 5, a group of forms are vital to your disaster plan. During a disaster, keeping a record of all the activities early on is absolutely essential because disasters often escalate very quickly. In particular, one of the things we see get missed is when a large number of volunteers arrive. So volunteers arrive, we assign them tasks. Oh, you've come to the emergency department to help. You have experience in trauma nursing. Oh, perfect. Go into the trauma room and join the trauma team. If we don't record where people are, who they are, and how to get a hold of them, this structure quickly escalates. And other reasons we might use forms, other places where forms are vital is keeping track of the organizational structure. Communications plan, how do we talk to one another? An incident check-in, how do we know who's still here and who's left? Task force and strike team assignment lists, how do we know who is supervising whom? And a supplies work list. How do we get more supplies and how do we know when they arrive? Here's an example of a simple form, an instant check-in. We have a name, we have the agency, their initial assignment, their contact, and their time in and their time out. And these forms can be electronic, they can be analog, whatever works best for your situation. But the important thing is that these forms are there and people use them in the event of a disaster. I like the standard operating procedures and the checklist to refer directly to these forms when they're going to be needed, so people are reminded to use those forms. Number 6, a debriefing plan. Debriefing is often called the after-action review, and there are as many ways to do a debriefing as there are ways to design a disaster plan. In general, debriefs should capture operational opportunities for future events. They should improve coordination and communications with the stakeholders, and they should contribute to more effective operations and activities. Debriefs can take a variety of forms. Some may include a designated facilitator, and usually they have a structured agenda that allows for both open and directed discussion. One of the big things we talk about in disaster medicine is lessons learned versus lessons observed. And I really like this which is written in the Government of BC's Guides to After Action Review, that says key findings and topics of discussion gathered from the debrief should be quickly transcribed into formal notes. This forms the debrief session report. Having a debrief and everybody gets their feelings out, everybody gets their ideas out, their suggestions out, but failure to record this means often that those lessons are learned, but they're not observed and they cannot be acted upon. So make sure those debriefing results are recorded. And finally, the seventh part of an MCI disaster plan is a training plan. Now, there are many, many ways to develop training in disaster medicine. So one is lectures, and this has been traditionally a way that we learn lots about disaster medicine. This is particularly interesting for skill sets. Perhaps you're trying to teach someone how command and control works, or how to develop a hazard vulnerability analysis. Lectures are a very good way to get skilled individuals to teach to a large group very quickly, but sometimes difficult to engage people. Role play and tabletops. We do a lot of these in disaster medicine. Often they involve a simulation type exercise where people are asked to try to imagine in their minds how things would pan out and how they would act. Computer simulations are obviously a much newer way to do this, and we're seeing a lot more of these. These are an excellent way to involve people in interactive environments. They are, however, dependent on having the right software platform, and they can be a bit tricky because many of them have various degrees of computer literacy required and can be tricky for some people to catch on to. And finally, the final training exercise is really these live exercises where you bring in simulated disasters. And these can be very interesting. They can sometimes reveal amazing things that you wouldn't otherwise think of. I saw in one disaster simulation that the disaster plan had called for the ambulances to park outside and wheel the patients in on stretchers into the ambulance bay. Interestingly, the step between the ambulance bay and the outside was probably about 2 centimeters high, which was easy for an ambulance to negotiate, but virtually impossible for a wheelchair or stretcher. And that's the sort of thing that sometimes you can't find except in a live exercise. Live exercises, of course, the problem being they're extremely expensive and difficult to organize. So again, in summary, the objectives of this lesson were to recognize the basic components of a complete disaster plan, to understand the advantages and disadvantages of the different types of training exercises, and to describe how to set up an effective debriefing. I hope that this short lesson will put you well on your way to developing your own disaster plan.